before I had the language. For a long time, I did not have the right words for what was happening to me. I knew I was struggling. I knew I was in pain. I knew eating had become harder than it should have been. I knew my body was already carrying more than most people could see. But I did not yet have the language to explain how everything was connected, or why something that looked dental from the outside was actually affecting my health in a much bigger way. That is part of how these stories begin. Not with one dramatic moment, but with a slow wearing down. A person adjusts. They work around pain. They change what they eat. They stop talking about certain things. They learn to live smaller around a problem because dealing with the problem directly feels too hard, too complicated, too exposing, or too overwhelming. That was my life for a long time. What was happening in my mouth was not separate from the rest of me. It affected how I ate, how much I could tolerate, how much energy I had, and how stable the rest of my health could be. I was already living with serious medical issues that made nutrition, digestion, pain, and medication management harder than they should have been. So when my oral condition got worse, it did not stay in one neat category. It touched everything. I had trouble chewing. I relied heavily on soft foods and shakes. My intake was limited. My body was already dealing with other problems, and this made them harder to manage. It is difficult to explain to someone who has never lived it, but eating stops feeling ordinary when your body and your mouth are both working against you. Food turns into strategy. Nutrition turns into math. Medication turns into another problem, because some medicines are supposed to be taken with food, and food is exactly what you are struggling with. From the outside, none of that looks dramatic enough. That is another thing I learned. A person can be losing ground quietly while still looking fine enough to other people. A person can be adapting to dysfunction so constantly that even they stop realizing how much they have normalized. There was also shame in it, silence, history, things I was not ready to explain to everyone, things I had carried for years. There are some kinds of damage that do not stay in the past even when the events themselves are long over. They remain in the body, in fear, in avoidance, in what a person puts off because they cannot bear one more thing. What looked like delay from the outside was often pain, trauma, exhaustion, or survival from the inside. By the time I began trying to address this seriously, I was not dealing with one clean issue. I was dealing with the accumulated weight of health problems, oral dysfunction, fear, fatigue, and a system I did not yet understand. At first, I do not think I fully understood the kind of case I had. I knew I needed help. I knew I needed treatment. I knew what was happening was affecting my life in a real and serious way. But I had not yet learned the language the system would require from me. I had not yet learned that it was not enough to know something was medically important. You often have to prove it in exactly the right terms, in exactly the right sequence, with exactly the right framing, or the system will shrink it into something easier to dismiss. That was one of the hardest lessons. Because this was never about cosmetics. It was never about vanity. It was never about asking for something extra. I was trying to protect my ability to eat, to function, and to keep the rest of my health from becoming even more unstable. But if I said that in plain human language, it still was not always enough. Somewhere along the way, I realized that the truth of the experience and the language of the system were not the same thing. Once I began understanding that, everything changed. I started gathering records. I started pulling together the pieces that showed the bigger picture. Doctor notes, treatment plans, medical history, gastrointestinal records, evidence of nutritional impact, evidence of what daily life had become. I began trying to tell the story not as I need dental work, but as what it really was, a medical necessity issue tied to function, nutrition, pain, stability, and quality of life. That should have made things simpler. In some ways, it made things clearer. But it also introduced me to a system that often struggles with anything that does not fit neatly into one box. What followed was not just a request for care. It became a fight to make the truth of my case legible. There were different departments, different terms, different tracks, different case numbers, different kinds of notices, and different ways the same issue could be described depending on who was looking at it. There were process questions I did not know I would need to ask. There were records I had to make sure were actually attached where they needed to be. There were moments where it felt like I had to become my own advocate, organizer, translator, and investigator all at once, while still living inside the health problems that had started this in the first place. That is when I began to understand something bigger than my own case. Systems do not always fail people by saying no right away. Sometimes they fail people through confusion, through slowness, through fragmentation, through technical language that hides the human stakes, through making the sick person do the labor of clarity while the institution keeps acting as though the matter is still merely procedural. A file can sit calmly in review while the person connected to it is not calm at all. That is the hidden violence of these systems. They make the process look orderly on paper while the person inside it is paying with time, strength, weight, stability, and peace of mind. I did not know at the beginning how much this would change me. I did not know how much I would have to learn. I did not know how many times I would need to explain the same truth in slightly different language just to keep it from being misunderstood. And I did not know how deeply this experience would shape my desire to help other people later. But that is where the story really begins. Not with the paperwork, not with the appeal, not with the denial. It begins earlier than that, in the quiet period when something real is already affecting your life, but you do not yet have the language, structure, or support to force the world to see it clearly. And once you do, you realize that getting help is only one part of the fight. The other part is making sure your story is told in a way the system cannot keep getting wrong.